that you can hang out and, respond to things. You can certainly send things in chat, or if you have a microphone or access to a microphone, you can always hit the on button and unmute yourself. If you do have stuff in the background ever, like if you're not in a nice quiet place or you have dogs. I had one student who had so many dogs, and for some reason, every time she was online, her dogs would not stop barking. So if you do have barky dogs or something like that, you can always mute yourself, and you can mostly stay muted all the time. It's perfectly up to you, and you can, in fact, you can stay muted completely and just type in answers in the chat box. So either way is acceptable. The main thing is, and I'm going to keep my participants box up a little bit just so I can make sure and notice if anybody's here. But for the most part, we're going to go through the story today, and we won't cover the other one. We'll do that. The other one from last week, we will do this evening with the 5 o'clock chat. And anytime people don't come to a chat, I won't record. I'll just skip it to the next one. We have 3 chats a week, and so we should be able to manage all the things that we need to manage. I did post the discussion post for our, the topics for your fiction essay. So if you want to read the 2 possible assignments, we went over those in the recording last time, and I have not been able to post the recording yet, but I'll try to, if I can't make a link to it, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I've got to get it to you some way. I think what I might have to do is put it on YouTube and then put a YouTube link in a folder in the fiction module. So that's how I do it for my humanities class. So that's maybe what we just have to do. But I'll try to put titles, so, for the different chats, so it covers different stories. And so if, for instance, you can't go to a chat and it was over a particular story that you had difficulties with, that can be one that you make sure you go and look up. And if you thought you pretty much had it covered for that particular story, then you don't have to watch all of the videos, obviously. So that's what I will try to do in future. And hopefully we'll have it covered and everything will go smoothly from here on out. So if you do have questions as you go, you can always put a question in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and ask me a question at any time. And I'm going to ask you questions, so feel free to don't worry about being wrong, or don't worry if you misread something or you skipped something or you just didn't catch that detail. I'm just going to try to make sure everybody's on the same page every time we talk about these stories. So that's kind of where we're going. Now, do any of you know what's the other story that we already read that Kate Chopin wrote?
The Story of an Hour?
Yes. Who was that? Was that Callie or Jordan?
Jordan.
Yay! Okay, star for you. Yes.
Yay.
And she actually, I mean, there are a number of stories she's written that are very much worth reading. So if you liked her fiction, there are other ones I can certainly recommend. But above all, I would recommend her novel, The Awakening, which kind of, it deals a lot with some of the themes from A Story of an Hour, but it was very poorly received, and actually she published nothing after she published that book. It was so badly received. So many people were angry because of the subject matter within that book and the choices that the main character made. But the truth is I mean, it's a story that's actually pretty common during the 20th century, the 19th century. Kind of a lot of women and even men wrote about women who pretty much had few rights and lots of social limitations. And whenever they tried to stray outside of the box that they were placed in, it usually wasn't a good thing for their lives, at least eventually. So, but I just wanted to make sure that you had that on your radar, that she wrote both of those 2 stories. Now, normally this is not a Kate Chopin love fest, so don't feel, and I didn't write this story, so remember, you can like or dislike anything you wish to. You can hate characters or love characters, and people probably won't agree with you, and that's perfectly okay. But let's make sure in this session that we get to the point where we at least can see exactly what's going on with this story, so that we can follow along, everything can be cool, and all the details that you might think you're not sure about. Okay. So if you have any questions as you were reading something, you're like, what does that exactly mean? Especially if it's terminology or, some of the vocabulary, of course, has changed over the last 125 years or whatever. So feel free if there's something you're like, what is that? Um, it's really good for you to ask questions because other people can't. So one thing I do want to make sure and remind everybody, and you'll probably have seen all of this stuff in here anyway, but it's common in a lot of her other stories as well. She was a part of kind of the upper class New Orleans society. So she actually spoke a lot of French, as did much of the upper class. We think about Creole, but well, many of the gentry or that kind of upper class group within the New Orleans society and in Louisiana in general were bilingual. So they spoke both French and English. And sometimes there were characters who might have, speak with French inflection, if not a lot of French words. And you'll notice that the names, for instance, Valmonde, that's not a tip that sounds French. And even the fact that she's called Madame is a very French way of speaking. But again, they're upper class and they are, for the most part, plantation society. So these are people who own lots of acres of land, are primarily in the agricultural business, and at this point, this is actually set back in time from when she wrote it, but at this point, this is still a society that owns slaves. And so that's something to keep in mind as we go through this, that it's even earlier than what she talks about. And yet, can we use historical fiction to comment on current events? Yes. Was it likely that the upper class Creole society at Kate Chopin's current time was still very much reflecting the slave caste society that was typical 50 years prior? Yes. So she may be still commenting on, if not the actual, institution of slavery, she's absolutely commenting on the prejudice that still is retained from that institution at the time that she writes. So do we have prejudice today? Is that something that we still deal with, even though slavery no longer is allowed in this country, and in most developed countries it is not allowed? There is an undercurrent of a slave trade still throughout the world, but it is largely illegal. But do we still have, remnants of this that that come up in people's prejudices, either against people who were descended from slaves, or because of skin color, or because of nation of origin? Do we still have this? You can tell me what you think.
Yes.
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 Yes, we don't have, legal slaves, and yet there's still a lot of prejudice. And Kate Chopin is likely dealing with much of that, and she's certainly commenting upon that tendency even in her time period. Even though it's been over 100 years since, we probably will have vestiges of this kind of, racial prejudice, especially for, hopefully not, but it could be centuries to come. And there may be some groups that never let go of it as well. So that there's there's a feeling among different groups. We saw it crop up pretty heinously within the Third Reich under Hitler. This idea that there's some ideal human and all the other humans that aren't ideal are inferior, or even, as he did, even needed to be destroyed, like the entire Jewish population. But fortunately, he was unsuccessful in destroying all of them, but he did manage to kill, or have killed over 6 million people in concentration camps. So that kind of institution is still there. Now, it's not just a matter of prejudice, though, that is being commented on in this story. A lot of it is also class. So, upper class people, and what their privileges are, and what they can and can't do, and how they view themselves. Certainly, there's this idea too of parentage. Where do your genes come from? And if you can't trace your lineage back, what does that say about you? And for a lot of these landed groups, again, they come from this idea of aristocracy. We don't have, I mean, our aristocracy in the United States is usually based on money. You know, how much money do you have and how much money has your family had? You know, like the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, stuff like that. But in other countries, you know, especially from European origins, one's family lineage matters. And so the upper class is, you know, even if they don't have lots of money, the upper class is the nobility. And that's completely determined by birth. So your father, if your father is an earl or a duke or a count or a, you know, goodness knows there's so many different ranks, then you will have a higher rank. You'll be part of that nobility and you'll have a higher rank than ordinary people. In the United States, though, we don't have that so much, but there is, at least as far as we can tell here, an aristocracy. Even the idea of madame, you know, that someone can have, you know, it's not just Mr. and Mrs. There's a little bit of a difference here, but obviously her family had a, you know, the prestige of land ownership. Now, this is something else to remember, and it's you know, in some ways crucial. At this time, even though in the United States we didn't have nobility or, you know, there's this upper class that was designed, you know, based upon some noble class. Instead, it was based on money, and most of the money was retained in land. And so how much land you had in many ways determined how much money you had. And that also determined how many slaves you owned. And that was part of your quote unquote property. All of this stuff is dependent on, you know, it's all socioeconomic status, but it added to that social status, not just one's economic status. And so owning a lot of land, owning a lot of slaves also gave you other rights. For instance, at this time, at even when Kate Chopin was writing, if you did not own land in the United States, you could not legally vote. So all this voting, you know, we have a ton of voting rights today. You know, I can vote. Women can vote, which they couldn't at the time of Kate Chopin's writing this. They did not get that right until 1920. But at the same time, we also, you know, if you didn't own land, so I mean, I don't know how, I'm not going to take a poll, and yet my kids, for instance, you know, my husband and I own land. Well, actually, at that time, I couldn't own land, so only my husband of the two of us would have been able to vote. But our children lived with us; they didn't own land. So neither one of them, even though they're both over 18, neither one of them would have been able to vote. Tons of people in this country, though, rent their homes and rent different things, even land that they work. They might, you know, lease the land and use it for agriculture. If they don't own the land at this time, you know, go back 125 years, they could not vote. And so in some ways, that those people with that upper class status, the people who owned the land and had the most wealth, they were the only ones who really had any control over the government as well, because they were the only ones who could vote. And now that's changed radically. So today, any of us, you know, as long as we reach the age of 18, we can register to vote as an American citizen. And so even if we don't own land, we don't have to own, you know, a tiny home on, you know, we just, we don't own anything. We don't even have to have a car, and we can still vote legally because they have changed all of those laws. So, but at this time, though, remember, if you had any power and you had any status, for the most part, you owned land and you had wealth, even in the United States. So now we have essentially two families of this landed gentry, this upper class families. One family is the Valmondes, and the other family is who? You can say Armand's family if you want.
Pygmies?
The Aubigny's, yeah, it's all French. So even Desiree is French, and of course the Valmonde, and then Monsieur. All of those are going to be French titles because again, this is the French kind of, you know, Creole group. So we have, yeah, so Armand, and they're neighbors. And he was just, you know, she was. What happened to her though? How was Desiree? How did she become part of the Valmonde family?
She was adopted.
Right. She was actually found when Monsieur, he was literally riding through the gateway to his estate, and she was lying asleep in the shadow of one of the stone pillars. And he went, "Oh, what a cute little kid." And at that point, the only thing she was so small that the only word she even knew was dada. And so they thought, well, did she wander in? It even said the prevailing belief was that she'd been left by a party of Texans, people on the way to go to Texas. And so but they don't know. Nobody knows where she came from. She was there. And so, but at the time, um, the truth is Madame and Monsieur, the Valmondes didn't have any children. And so they said, yay, essentially Madame Valmonde abandoned every speculation. She didn't care. And she said Desiree had been sent to her by a beneficent providence to be the child of her affection. In other words, I don't have a kid, and so God sent me this kid. And she pretty much treats her like her real kid. There's no, oh no, you were adopted. And, in fact, Desiree really doesn't know much about her past. She doesn't remember, of course, anything about when, before she was picked up by the Valmondes. But um, they raised her like their own kid, and they loved her. So she was beautiful and gentle, affectionate and sincere, and she was the idol of Valmonde. So she was loved, very, very much loved, despite the fact that they don't know where she came from. So the whole class thing, who's your family and where are you from, didn't matter to them at all. Now, of course, she's beautiful. So she is like probably 19, maybe a little younger. And Armand comes riding by and instantly falls in love with her because she's really pretty. And it even says that was the way all the Auvergnese fell in love, as if struck by a pistol shot. The wonder was that he had not loved her before, for he'd known her since his father brought him home from Paris. Now, he is not only French, he has that French background, but he actually came from Paris. Now, listen to this family, though. This is interesting detail. And I don't know if you guys picked it up before, but you probably didn't pick it up the first time. But the wonder was that he had not loved her before, so since he'd known her since his father brought him home from Paris, a boy of 8. So he'd been there for a while, but he'd been brought at 8 years old from Paris after his mother died. Now, why? This is a question to ask. Why was his mother not living with his dad? And now we will find, probably pretty soon, well, by the end of the story, we have indications as to why. And so that's the question, why? And I don't know if you guys picked it up. The first time I read this ever, years ago, because I'm an old person, I didn't pick up at all in the fact that mom was in Paris. And then, so she and her son were both in Paris. She dies, and the dad finally comes and picks him up and brings him home. And immediately it's very distracting because then she tells us this detail, and then immediately goes back to him falling in love. And he's head over heels in love. Now, Monsieur Valmonde, this is the dad, remember the stepdad, or I don't know, adopted father or whatever. He grew practical and wanted things well considered. Okay, yes, you're in love with her, but I need to tell you first, she was a foundling. We don't know where her parents are. We don't know, was she in the traveling group of Texans? We have no idea where she came from. I just found her. Armand looks at her, but she's so pretty, and he doesn't care. He says, I don't care where she came from. I'm in love with her. We're in love, in love, in love, in love, in love. And he was reminded that she was nameless. We gave her the name Desiree, but is that her real name? Probably not. We don't know where she came. She doesn't have a last name. She doesn't have a surname. So we don't, and for Armand, he says, well, who cares? I can give her my name, my illustrious, that one of the oldest and proudest names in Louisiana. He doesn't care. He says over and over, okay, I know she has obscure origins. We don't know where she came from. We don't know her last name or what her family is. I don't care. She's going to be part of my family now. I will give her my name and then she'll be fine. And so, okay. And then they got married. Now, then pretty soon afterwards, she gets pregnant. And it's, I mean, that's half the reason you get married anyway, especially upper class. The number one thing you need to do is get an heir. So she's supposed to have a baby. So we skip kind of ahead in time. Madame Valmont had not seen Desiree and the baby for 4 weeks. So now we're skipping ahead. They got married. So she's already had a kid now. When she gets there, she shuddered at the first sight of it, as she always did. When she gets to his plantation, L'Abri, is a sad-looking place which for many years had not known the gentle presence of a mistress. So it was, remember, it was Dad by himself. Mom was in Paris. Mom died. Then he went and got Armand and brought him back, but it was just him and Armand and the plantation. So there's no wife there for forever. And Madame Valmont isn't comfortable at that place. And it even says Monsieur Aubigny had married and buried his wife in France, and then she loved her own land too well to ever leave it. So now we get another detail. So she's in France because she just doesn't want to live in Louisiana. But then there's a little description, and then it says young Aubigny, this is Armand, his rule over his slaves was a strict one, and under his and this is really important stuff. His Negroes had forgotten how to be gay, and that just means happy. It's an older term, as they had been during the old master's easygoing and indulgent lifetime. So now we have Armand. His dad, we find out, was actually pretty nice to his slaves. He was generous. He was easygoing. He didn't work them very hard, or at least not too hard, and he probably treated them pretty well. Armand, how does he treat slaves?
He's not nearly as nice as his dad.
No. And his slaves had forgotten how to be happy. Like they'd forgotten the easy time because he was tough and he was mean and he was strict. And so that probably adds to Madame Valmont's discomfort because she knows that it's more of it's a darker place to live anyway. Now, of course, inside, for the most part, inside the house is where Desiree is going to be. So she's not taking care of slaves necessarily, but she's kind of a soft-hearted kid anyway. But she finds her in bed. The baby was beside her upon her arm where he had fallen asleep. So it's a boy. That's a good thing. There's an heir. And then she says the yellow nurse. Now I don't want to use a bunch of racial epithets. Those are going to pop up, especially when we have anything that's dealing with multiple races. A lot of terms that they used to use. All that the yellow means is more than likely it's not actually term. It was a term that was used a lot for Asian populations. It does not mean that here. It means she is technically a mulatto. She is part part African American, part white. So she has lighter skin. And that's a lot of the the interior slaves, the slaves that would be kept inside of a house working, would be the ones with the lighter skin. And that's just honestly, because of prejudice more than anything else. So she's the nurse, though, for the baby, for Desiree's baby. And then Madame Valmont bent her portly figure over Desiree and kissed her, holding her an instant tenderly. So she still loves her daughter, of course. Then she turned to the child. And then she says, "This is not the baby." And she says, "I knew you would be astonished," this is Desiree, "at the way he has grown. Look at his legs, Mama, and his hands." And the cochon de lait is like, it's a term of endearment. Lait is milk. So it's honestly like the little milk shell or something. Then she says, "Look, he has hands and fingernails, real fingernails." And she says, "Isn't it true?" She goes, "Yes." And she goes, "And the way he cries is deafening." And so she's just enjoying being a mom. Madame Valmont, though, is troubled. And she's troubled because, and she's staring at the child because she sees definite African roots in the child's face. And so she's, and it's, does it bother Madame Valmont? No. What is she afraid of? That it will bother someone else. And that's, and she actually gets that. She goes, yes, the child has grown, has changed, she says slowly. And then she goes, what does Armand say? Because that's what she's worried about. What is Armand going to say if he thinks the child has African genes, essentially, comes from an African past? Now, Desiree's face became suffused with a glow. So she's like, oh no, he's the proudest father ever. So Armand's cool. So she's really glad it's a boy. Armand is really glad it's a boy, though he would have loved a girl as well. But then, and she says, and Mama, she says, this is to Madame Valmont, she says, he hasn't punished one of them. She's talking about the slaves. Not one of them since baby is born. So in other words, even the slaves that are more trouble, she says he doesn't beat any of them anymore. Like so the assumption is that he was even tougher beforehand to the slaves. Then she has a baby, and he's being gentler with the slaves than he was before. And what Desiree said was true. Marriage and later the birth of a son had softened Armand's imperious and exacting nature greatly. And this was what made the gentle Desiree so happy. So she doesn't want to treat the slaves badly. She wants him to treat them kindly, the way that his dad did. And she doesn't have the same prejudices towards the slaves that Armand does. But she's kind of scared about him too. She's in love with him, but when he frowned, she trembled and yet still loved him. When he smiled, she asked for no greater blessing of God, but Armand's dark, handsome face had not often been disfigured by frowns since the day he fell in love with her. So in other words, he's been happier and kinder and far less angry and, condemnatory or strict or all these other things since he met Desiree. So she's had a positive effect on him until something changes. What changes?
Bond realizes that there's something off about the baby.
Yeah, the baby is not as white as Armand thought he would be. He's noticing the color of the baby's skin. Now, it's funny, and I tell this story because it's real. I was in South Carolina when I had my first child, and my husband is Hispanic, so both of our children are kind of a mixture. We have a daughter and a son. Both of them are, my son actually looks just like my husband, but has my coloring, and except slightly darker hair. And then my daughter, has more of the darker features, but she looks like honestly a cross between two of my sisters and my husband's sister. So it's weird how genetics happen, but my daughter has much darker skin than my son does, and yet they're both really a product of two different gene pools is essentially what happened. So, but in this case too, and they when I was pregnant, actually I was surrounded by a lot of, we had one of my best friends was there. She was Hispanic, but I was expecting, and I'm extremely blonde, in case you guys wonder, because you don't have a picture of me, so you can't see. But my several people said, remember, babies are born and their skin's lighter when they're born than it's going to be. So their skin is going to get darker. And a lot of the couples in there laughed about it. And I said, why? And one guy admitted, he says, well, the first time when was their second kid, and he admitted that the first time they had a kid, he swore that child wasn't his. He says the kid was white and he was African American. And I said, you really thought that your wife had? And he goes, yeah. He goes, they didn't tell me then. He says, so I'm glad they talked about it now. And they were all laughing about it. And I thought, well, I didn't even know that, But that's kind of the case in this. So the baby was born, and when the baby was first born, his skin was lighter, and it is slowly getting darker and really reflecting his actual African heritage. And so it took a while. Like, other people noticed. Madame Valmont noticed far earlier, but Desiree and Armand, they notice later. And Armand probably notices it a little bit faster than Desiree does. So she notices something's off, and yet she doesn't know what it is. But she says there's something in the air menacing her peace. And essentially, it's probably, more than anything else, a strange, awful change in her husband's manner, which she dared not ask him to explain. So he's acting weird, and she's afraid to say, "What's going on, honey?" because she doesn't know how he's going to react. When he spoke to her, it was with averted eyes from which the old love light seemed to have gone out. So he's not looking her in the face. That's actually a really good, if you read people, I'm a people reader, but if people don't look you in the eye, there's something often that is going on that makes them not look, not look you in the eye. And he does that. He absented himself from home. That means, so he left home and was gone for a while. And when there, avoided her presence without excuse. So he just, even when he was in the house, he hardly ever saw her or the baby. And the very spirit of Satan suddenly seemed to take hold of him in his dealings with the slaves. So suddenly he was acting so nice, and he's no longer acting so nice. And Desiree becomes more and more miserable. And she's upset by all of this, not just that he won't spend time with her, but the way he's suddenly treating the slaves. Remember, she was so happy that he was being kinder to the slaves than he had been. So then finally, she notices, she actually compares, and the word quadroon is also that mulatto idea, the idea of someone being partly slave and partly white. Now, a lot of the reason that we had so many people, and this is just a reality, this is where we get history, but a lot of the reason there were so many children and even slaves of mixed race, who had lighter skin or who had very Caucasian features or could even pass for Caucasian, is because so many slave owners impregnated their own slaves. And we know this historically. We know, we have actual diaries kept by the mistress of the house, who talked about which slaves her husband had impregnated this time, and would often be, very jealous of whatever slave was his perfect personal favorite. But then the slave would become pregnant. He would actually, once the slave had given birth, that baby would often be sold to another plantation. And it was really horrible I don't want you to get too much into that kind of stuff, but it did happen. And so many people who owned slaves also used those slaves in ways they should not have, even worse. You were a slave in everything. You had no choice about anything. And so it is highly likely that many of these people, these slaves who are, who have mixed race, are the product of either past slave owners and slaves, their parents and stuff. But then they were sold off to others, or even kept on, there were many people who were plantation owners who kept their own slaves, knowing that these kids were actually their own children. They were actually biologically related to them. So anyway, though, she gets to this point. This is when Desiree finally figures it out, and she sees her son playing with another little boy, and the boy is partially, he's he has mixed race, and the child is actually fanning her son. Desiree's eyes had been fixed absently and sadly upon the baby while she was striving to penetrate the threatening mist that she felt closing about her. So she's kind of contemplating, why is Armand acting the way he is? She looked from her child to the boy who stood beside him and back again over and over. And she exclaims, and the blood turned like ice in her veins. So she realizes suddenly, it's been months, but she realizes suddenly that her child is of mixed race. And that must be what Armand is upset about. But he must have noticed. And then her husband comes in without noticing her, went to a table and began to search among papers. And she says to him, Armand, look at our child. What does it mean? Tell me. So she finally notices. He looks, he looks at her. He gently loosened her fingers from about his arm and thrust the hand away from him. So an absolute gesture of rejection. She says, tell me what it means. And he says, it means, in this kind of polite voice, that the child is not white. It means that you are not white. Now we know why does he treat her the way that he is treating her now. It's because he looks at her and goes, oh great, I married a woman without knowing it, married a woman who was part slave. And it's horrifying to him. He's that prejudiced that he immediately turns away from her. And then she says, it's a lie. It's not true. I am white. Look at my hair. It's brown. My eyes are gray. You know they are gray. And my skin is fair. Look at my hand. It's whiter than yours. Now that's a key note to remind yourself of. And she's almost hysterical. And he says, as white as La Blanche's, he returned cruelty, who is of mixed race, and went away to leave her alone with a child. So she writes to Madame Valmond. And what does Valmond say? She says, they tell me I'm not white. Armand has told me I'm not white. What do I know? I mean, what do I do? I cannot be so unhappy and live. And she writes, Madame Valmond, does she write back, you horrible person? I reject you too because you're part race. No.
Oh, she tells her that she can come home, that she wants her
Yeah.
to come home.
Yeah, bring the baby, come on home. I'll love you forever. Come to Valmonde. Back to your mother who loves you. Come with your child. In other words, I accept you. I accept your baby. We don't care. Just come on home. When the letter reached Desiree, she went with it to her husband's study and laid it upon the desk before which he sat. He read the words. He said nothing. She goes, shall I go, Armand? He said, yes, go. Do you want me to go? Yes, I want you to go. He thought God had dealt cruelly and unjustly with him and felt somehow that he was paying him back in kind when he stabbed thus into his wife's soul. So she, who is in love with Armand, truly in love with Armand, feels completely abandoned and rejected. He no longer loved her because the unconscious injury she had brought upon his home and his name. So he literally, as soon as he found out she had any racial mixing, he was done. All that, oh, I don't care where she came from. I love her so much. No, instant rejection. So she leaves. She turned away like one stunned by a blow, walked slowly towards the door, hoping he would call her back. Goodbye, Armand, she moaned. He did not answer her. That was his last blow at fate. So he's angry that God did this to him. So he's going to get her back. We'll get God back through her. Now, this is what happened. So Desiree went in search of her child. Zandrine was pacing the somber gallery with it. She took the little one from the nurse's arms with no word of explanation, and descending the steps, walked away under the live oak branches. So she just gets her baby, doesn't pack, and she just walks. And it's sunset. It was an October afternoon. The sun was just sinking. Out in the still fields, the Negroes were picking cotton. Desiree had not changed the thin white garment nor slippers which she wore. Her hair was uncovered. The sun's rays brought a golden gleam from its brown meshes. She did not take the broad, beaten road which led to the far-off plantation of Valmonde. So she did not get on the road, and even walking. She obviously didn't take a carriage or anything, but she didn't even walk in the direction of the Valmonde plantation. She walked across a deserted field where the stubble bruised her tender feet so delicately shod and tore her thin gown to shreds. She disappeared among the reeds and willows that grew thick along the banks of the deep, sluggish bayou, and she did not come back again. So did she go home?
No.
No. She went out and died. She said when she wrote the letter to Madame Valmont, she said, I will just die. I shall die. I must die. I cannot be so unhappy and live. And that's what happened. So some weeks later, now this is weeks later, so she disappears. Armand doesn't go seek her out. He doesn't want to ever see her again. He doesn't care what happened to her because he hates her now. He's furious that he made the mistake of getting married to her. And so he essentially, they have a huge bonfire. What's in the bonfire? What's he burning?
Is he burning her and the baby?
No, but he is burning all of the vestiges of her and the baby.
He burns
So,
the cradle.
yeah, he burns the cradle. He burns the baby's clothing, the bedding, his wife's clothing, everything. And the last thing to go, so with silk gowns, velvet and satin ones, all the stuff, anything that was, I mean, really expensive stuff too. And he's burning it all. Like he wants to eradicate that she ever existed and that he ever married her and that there ever was a baby. So is he feeling any sort of, regret? No, none. The last thing to go was a tiny bundle of letters, innocent little scribblings that Desiree had sent to him during the days of their espousal. There was the remnant of one back in the drawer. So he's cleaning out the drawers to essentially throw all of the furnishings in a heap and burn it all. But he's, of course, what's he going to do with those letters? He's going to throw them. He's going to burn them. But he said, but this last remnant was not Desiree's. It was part of an old letter from his mother to his father. He read it. She was thanking God for the blessing of her husband's love. But above all, she wrote, night and day, I thank the good God for having so arranged our lives that our dear Armand will never know that his mother, who adores him, belongs to the race that is cursed with the brand of slavery. Now, we don't know all of the particulars, but remember, his mother lived in France. And he came back from France at 8 years old. Would he really have a sense of his mom's racial background? No, we don't. And yet she makes it very clear in this letter that she was at least part Black. We don't know how much, but we know she was. And yet, oh, thank goodness he looks white. And remember, his hands, when Desiree showed him her hands, she goes, see, my hands are whiter than yours. Well, because he's the one with slavery. Now, could Desiree still have a background, with some slave blood in her? Yes, absolutely she could. And yet his assumption was, I come from this, upstanding, long lineaged family, we have so much great status. Of course it could not be me. And yet it is. Now, what's he going to do with that letter?
Burns it.
Yeah. Yeah, of course he's going to burn it. Now, I guess this is my question. Is he ever going to marry again?
I don't think he will because now he knows that he can't have an heir that's fully white because it's his fault.
Well, yeah, and I mean, fault. It's an interesting word because yeah, he blames her. He lays the fault, quote unquote, but he lays that genetic element completely in her court, and yet it's his. And so no matter what wife he picks, it may come out. I mean, how many women is he going to send off into the woods to die with their baby? That's not going to work. So he may never marry again. And only because he is never going to allow that to, he's embarrassed. He's absolutely embarrassed by the fact that his child looked Black. And so I doubt he'd ever have a child. He'd rather keep his secret safe and burn all of the stuff, all of the any remnants, any signs that anything came out of that union than ever ever admit that he had any slave blood in him, even though he knows now it's true. He knows. Will he ever really sit there and face it and regret what he did? No, I don't see that happen. Not given his level of racism, I don't see that happening. What do you guys think?
Probably not, unfortunately.
No. Now, I mean, had Desiree, I mean, obviously, we know her choice. We don't know, it doesn't say she died, but she goes out into instead of going along the road to her parents' house, she goes off into the woods and disappears to the bayou, and she probably drowned herself. I mean, it's horrible to think about, but she was so devastated. She had thankfully throughout much of her life had unconditional love from her parents, but she did not have that from him at all, and she was very much in love with Armand, and she I guess accepted the blame and judged herself for it, which is also horrible. I mean, if she'd gone back to the Valmondes, obviously she would have been without Armand, but they would have taken care of both her and her child. And maybe if she hadn't, I mean, even if he hadn't sent her away so fast, or if her mom had come, I mean, if I were the mom, I would have like gotten in my carriage and gone over and gotten her, and then I don't think I just would have written her back. Maybe she was afraid of the reception, that Armand would kick her out, or I don't know. But the truth is it's a horrible ending, and it happened. It didn't have to happen. None of it had to happen. But what do you think? I mean, we have, kind of a point to a story of an hour, or several different themes that come out of it. What do you think is the point of this one, though?
Um, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is, but it's like not to be, I guess, not to be a hypocrite, not to assume that is somebody else's, um,
That it's
I'm
got
not
to be
sure what the
somebody
word
else's fault.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of it too, in some ways, we assume, and he deserved it, but we assume that Armand, his life is going to be dark and egregious, and he's just going to feel like he's suffering the rest of his life, like he was condemned by God or whatever. But the truth is what condemned him was his own prejudice. Had he been less of a mean dude, his life would have been totally different. Had he accepted the baby and accepted Desiree the way she was, the way that his own father accepted his mother, would she have ended badly? No. Would people around him have accepted the child and Desiree? Yes. And even if he found out later on, hey, actually, this was me, he wouldn't have had to eat crow or anything. He could have said, Desiree, I'm really sorry I judged you and I need to get over this. But he was so stubborn and so inflexible and unyieldingly mean. It's like he made the rest of his life, unfortunately, not just his life, but the life of all of the slaves who worked for him, they will all be miserable. It is probably unlikely he will ever be kind, because he's an unhappy man. But he brought all of this on himself because of his prejudice. They say, that hell, that we create our own hell, and I think in some ways that's what he did. He made life hell. He destroyed the lives of his wife and child, and then he made the rest of the lives around him horrible, including his own, because of his prejudice. And certainly, her ideas are ahead of their time in that, she's so adamant. There's, for us to read this now, we're not at all. I've never had a student go, well, Armand was just being, and make excuses for him. I've never had anybody really do that, because they look at it and go, really, he was willing to send his wife and child, own kid. This is his real kid, but he was willing to send them both away just because of something like this. And yet, he did. That's exactly what he did. At that time, yeah, that would have happened. People definitely would have done this. And yet many other people, including Kate Chopin, we assume, would not have. And so it shows the change, that kind of shift that Chopin in some ways is pushing towards, in the same way that so many people, and Kate Chopin, do not get this wrong, she was very white. And yet for her, slavery needed to end, and slavery needed to stop coming back in waves in this prejudice. So she may have been white, but she certainly did not look at Armand and see, and she judged him for his prejudice. He deserved what, he honestly, in some ways, the irony that's here, this, we call it dramatic irony or situational irony, is that by the end, both he and we know that he was judging her for his own issue. That he claimed, of course, it had to have been her, and yet he was the one who was part slave, and yet he has such a prejudice towards slaves. And it's kind of, I don't know if you've ever seen the commercials for, like, well, I mean, they actually did some studies where people would first express their, what racial prejudice do they have, or what group do they hate around the world, and they'd say, oh, I don't like, Russians, or I don't like Black people, or I don't like his, and then they'd find out genetically that they have 35% of their genes come from, Russia, or whatever these groups are that they hate. The truth is most of us are kind of called, I mean, we call ourselves mutts. I look very German because my grandfather and, both of my parents had a lot of German blood in them, but my grandmother was Navajo. And I don't look at all, I look like my grandfather's mom, is what everybody said. But my grandmother doesn't look anything like me, but she is absolutely, and I can trace so much of who I am to my grandmother. And she was Navajo. And so we have, I have uncles who have, I mean, I'm blonde, but my uncles have jet black hair and dark eyes. And so, and my dad, though, he was paler and he had more of the lighter features and gray eyes like I do. And so everything's kind of a jumble, though. We're all mutts. We're, none of us is the, you think about the purebred dogs. Well, we don't have those. We're just all kind of jumbled up. And that mixture is probably more healthy than anything genetically, but we still have prejudices based on it. And it's not just skin color, it's height, it's weight. Do you have, like, obesity genes and stuff like that? Do you have is a guy balding, or does he have a full head of hair? We judge people so much on so many things that they have absolutely no control over. And we blame them for things. So, oh, thanks, Dad, giving me powder baldness, that kind of stuff. So it's funny how we still do this. And we certainly, still see racial, religious, gender, age-based, all these different kinds of prejudices. They still run rampant through our communities, and yet so much of it is faultless. That we blame people for things they can't help. And that's like Desiree. She can't help. I mean, even if we don't know, honestly, in the end, whether she had any racial disparities. We don't know if she was racially mixed. We have no idea because she doesn't know. But does it matter? No. To most of us today, we're like, so what? And yet, to some, it still matters. So this is still, even though we don't, obviously slavery, legally does no longer exist, we still do deal with people who are this intractable. And some of it may be based on political lines, or, you don't talk politics. If you're going and meeting family, shh, don't tell them if you're on the other political side than they are. But a lot of it is that prejudice. It's still, I don't agree with you, therefore you're awful. Or you're not like me, and therefore you're bad, and I'll judge you. So that's still, I think in some ways still, this is very applicable, even though it was written more than 100 years prior to us. So prior to now. Any other thoughts? We're almost out of time. Any lingering questions? If you do have them, please put them in the chat or just turn on your mic and ask. And I will be more than willing to we can discuss any of it? Nope. Everybody good? Does that all make sense? Do you feel like we covered the story well enough? Is there nothing that still remains a question for you?
I don't have any more questions.
Okay, nobody else is chiming in, so I'm just hoping that you guys are all cool. And I will stop the recording, and then tonight in the evening one, we'll cover the other short story. So I will, if you can come, great. If not, remember, I'm going to record them, and then I'll post the recordings in YouTube and send you guys links. Okay? Thank you so much for coming, you guys. I appreciate it. See y'all later.
See
You're
ya.
welcome. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.